There is a moment in Scripture that most theologians quietly pass over. A moment so disturbing, so cosmically violent in its imagery, that the man who witnessed it fell upon his face as though struck down by an invisible hand. The year was approximately 593 BC. The prophet Ezekiel stood on the banks of the river Shebarar in the land of the Babylonian exile, a broken man in a broken land when the heavens tore open. What descended from that wound in the sky was not gentle. It was not luminous and soft-winged, draped in white linen, bearing a peaceful message. It was a storm, a fire folding upon itself, a brightness that consumed the eye, and within it moved beings. Ezekiel, a trained priest who had devoted his life to the study of sacred texts, who had memorized the ancient laws, who had stood before the altar of the Lord. This man could barely form words. And I fell upon my face, not in reverence, in terror. He had seen the Ophanim, the wheels, the burning ones, and what he saw that day would haunt every line he ever wrote. Modern Christianity has reduced the messengers of the divine to decorative figures on greeting cards, soft faces, feathered wings, a calm, reassuring smile. But the ancient texts, the original texts, the ones written before centuries of editorial distance, describe something else entirely, something that does not comfort, something that cannot be looked upon without consequence. The question that has haunted biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians for 3 millennia is this: what were they, truly? And why was their true form so carefully hidden from us? Welcome to Bible Secrets, Hidden History. Before we descend into these ancient archives, consider joining the community of seekers who gather here each week. If you believe this history deserves to be preserved, subscribe. If you believe this truth deserves to be heard, a single like carries it further than you know. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Vocabulary of Terror. To understand what Ezekiel saw, one must first understand what the ancient Hebrews meant when they used the word malach. In modern translation, malach is rendered as angel, a word now carrying 2,000 years of cultural softening. But in its oldest usage, malach simply meant messenger, or more precisely, one sent on divine decree. It carried no implication of beauty, no implication of comfort. It implied only authority, purpose, and overwhelming power. Knowledge bombshell, linguistic root. The Hebrew root lach connects to concepts of mission and dispatch. These beings were not created to be admired, they were created to execute. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, produced in the 3rd century BC, rendered malach as angelus. The softening had already begun, but the original Hebrew memory remembered the terror. There are, within the canonical scriptures and the ancient texts surrounding them, distinct classifications of divine beings. They are not the same. They do not occupy the same celestial rank, and they do not share the same form. The Seraphim appear in Isaiah chapter 6. The Ophanim, the wheels, appear in Ezekiel chapter 1 and chapter 10. The cherubim appear across multiple texts, from Genesis to Revelation, their form evolving and shifting in ways that suggest either multiple scribal traditions or deliberate theological concealment. Each classification is distinct. Each is terrifying in its own register, and none of them look like what we have been shown. Chapter 2. The Seraphim, the Burning Ones. In the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah entered the temple. What occurred within those walls was not a vision of comfort. It was a confrontation with cosmic reality so overwhelming that Isaiah's first response was a cry of total self-annihilation. Woe is me, for I am undone." The Hebrew word used there, nidmati, does not mean I am humbled. It means I am silenced. I am destroyed. I cease to exist. Above the throne, the seraphim stood. Knowledge bombshell, the name itself, seraph derives from the Hebrew verb seraph, to burn. These beings are not metaphorically associated with fire. Their name is fire. Their essence is combustion. In the ancient Near East, fire was not simply a physical phenomenon. Fire was the presence of the divine made visible and fatal to the unprepared. The burning bush of Moses. The pillar of fire above the tabernacle. Fire was divine immanence made tangible. Isaiah describes the seraphim with 6 wings. 2 cover the face, 2 cover the feet, 2 are used to fly. Modern interpreters focus on the symmetry, but the ancient reader would have noticed something else entirely. Why cover the face? Why would a being of such exalted celestial rank, positioned directly above the throne of the divine, need to shield its own face from what it served? Because the face of the seraph, uncovered and unrestrained, was itself an instrument of overwhelming power. Even these beings, older than creation as we know it, could not expose their full form in the presence of the throne without consequence. The seraphim are not beautiful in the human sense. They are beautiful the way a supernova is beautiful, awe-inspiring, annihilating, and absolutely indifferent to whether the observer survives the encounter. When one seraph descended to Isaiah with a burning coal from the altar and pressed it to his lips, this was not a gentle gesture of blessing. This was a surgery of the soul, performed without anesthesia. Chapter 3. The Ophanim, the architecture of the impossible return, now to Ezekiel. He has spent 2 years in exile. The temple he consecrated his life to serving has been desecrated. His world has been methodically disassembled by the Babylonian Empire. He is a man whose theological framework has been shattered by historical catastrophe. And then, the sky opens. What Ezekiel describes in the first chapter of his book, known in Jewish scholarship as the Merkabah, the divine chariot, is the most complex, disorienting, and theologically contested passage in the entire Hebrew Bible. For centuries, the Talmudic authorities placed severe restrictions on who could study it. Certain rabbinical schools forbade its public exposition entirely. The Talmud records that when one student began expounding the Merkabah too enthusiastically, fire descended from heaven and scorched the surrounding trees. The text itself was considered dangerous. Knowledge bombshell, the Dead Sea. Scrolls. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran between 1947 and 1956 were fragments known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, also called the Angelic Liturgy. These texts, produced by the Essene community roughly 100 years before the birth of Christ, describe the celestial temple and its divine beings in language that directly parallels Ezekiel's vision. The community at Qumran clearly believed they were participating in a liturgy that mirrored the worship being conducted simultaneously by the Ophanim in the heavenly realm. They were not reading Ezekiel as metaphor. They were reading it as architectural blueprint. Now, what did Ezekiel actually see? He saw 4 living creatures. Each had 4 faces, the face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Each had 4 wings. Their legs were straight. Their feet sparkled like polished brass. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. Beside each creature was a wheel, but not a simple wheel, a wheel within a wheel. The outer rim of each wheel was covered, completely, entirely, on every surface, with eyes, not decoratively, not symbolically. The wheels were eyes. Vision itself had been made structural. perception had been given physical form. The wheels moved without turning. They moved in any direction without repositioning, because they existed in a dimensional relationship with space that our geometry cannot accommodate. They were interconnected with the living creatures by something Ezekiel could only describe as spirit, an animating force that meant the wheels and the creatures were not separate entities. They were one system. Knowledge bombshell. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch, a text quoted directly in the canonical Epistle of Jude and held as scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, offers additional testimony. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, describes his own ascent through the celestial realms and his encounter with the Ophanim. He calls them the wheels of the Great One and states that they never sleep and never cease their watch. The all-seeing eyes are not ornamental. They are functional. The Ophanim are, in Enoch's description, the surveillance architecture of eternity itself, the divine faculty of omniscience, given physical, terrifying form. Chapter 4. The hidden reason for terror. The question must now be confronted directly. Why did these visions shatter the prophets who received them? It was not simply unfamiliarity. Ezekiel was a priest. Isaiah served in the temple. These were not men unaccustomed to sacred ritual, to the concept of divine proximity. These were men trained for it, and they were still undone. The answer lies not in what these beings looked like, but in what their appearance revealed. When Ezekiel saw the Ophanim, those living wheels of infinite perception, he was not simply seeing a strange creature. He was confronting the implications of what that creature's existence meant. The Ophanim do not sleep. The eyes do not close. The wheels do not stop. Everything is seen. Everything has always been seen. Nothing has ever been hidden. For a man in exile, a man who had watched the temple burn and had perhaps wondered, in the darkest hours, whether the divine presence had simply departed, this vision was a confrontation with something far more challenging than a monster. It was a confrontation with the reality of a watching, active, ever-present divine order that had not abandoned the world, but was engaged with it in ways that utterly transcended human comprehension. Knowledge bombshell, Josephus and the first-century context. The historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD in his Antiquities of the Jews, carefully avoids detailed description of the cherubim above the Ark of the Covenant. He writes that their form was something he could describe, but notes that no one can tell or even conjecture what was the shape of the cherubim. This is a deliberate withholding from a man who had extensive access to temple tradition. Even Josephus understood that the full description of these beings was not information to be casually distributed. The terror of the Seraphim arose from their proximity to absolute holiness, a proximity so overwhelming that even these ancient beings had to shield themselves from its full radiance. The terror of the Ophanim arose from what they represented, an inescapable, all-perceiving witness to every moment of human existence since the beginning of time. To see them was to understand, viscerally and permanently, that nothing is concealed. Not one thought, not one act, not one private darkness. The prophets fell on their faces because they had suddenly, without warning, understood the full weight of being known. Conclusion: the unveiled mystery and its weight. We live in an age that has replaced awe with information. We have cataloged, analyzed, digitized, and archived, and in doing so, we have allowed ourselves the comfortable illusion that the ancient world and its testimonies are simply primitive attempts at the explanations we now possess in superior form. But the prophets were not primitive men, grasping at explanations for thunder and lightning. Ezekiel was a trained theologian who witnessed something that broke the boundaries of every category he possessed. Isaiah was a sophisticated court prophet who encountered a presence so absolute that his first response was his own annihilation. The Essene scribes of Qumran copied and recopied descriptions of the Ophanim, not out of superstition, but out of the profound conviction that these texts held structural truth about the nature of reality itself. What the ancient world understood, and what modernity has systematically unlearned, is that the divine realm is not an extension of human experience. It is not scaled-up humanity. It is not a celestial government staffed by beings who share our aesthetics, our proportions, our comforting familiarity. It is other, entirely, irreducibly, incomprehensibly other. The Ophanim, with their infinite eyes and their wheels within wheels, do not exist to comfort the seeker. They exist to witness. They are the mechanism by which the eternal surveys the temporal, ancient beyond reckoning, tireless, present in every moment and every place simultaneously. The Seraphim, burning at the threshold of the throne, do not exist to deliver gentle messages. They exist at the intersection of the divine and the created, so saturated with the presence of the Absolute that proximity to them is itself an act of transformation or annihilation, depending on what the seeker carries within them. The ancient authors who preserved these accounts did not embellish them. In many cases, the evidence suggests they restrained them, hiding the full weight of what had been seen behind layers of priestly caution and scribal reserve. What we have received is already almost too much to bear. What was withheld may be beyond the capacity of human language to hold. The prophets knew this. They fell on their faces, they covered their eyes, they described what they could, and fell silent where description became impossible. Perhaps the most honest response, even now, 3,000 years later, is not analysis. Perhaps it is simply stillness, and the quiet, unsettling recognition that the wheels are still turning, the eyes are still open, and the burning has never ceased. For those who seek further, the next archive opens soon. What the Book of Enoch recorded about the Watchers and why that account was buried for 2,000 years awaits the seeker who is prepared to receive it. This has been Bible Secrets, Hidden History. The record does not end here.